Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Design and Manage an Exchange Infrastructure. This is a primary topic for the 70-341 Exchange 2013 Core Solutions exam. The subtopic that we're going to be discussing in this lesson is Plan and Manage Role-Based Access Control. So under the subject Plan and Manage Role-Based Access Control, or RBAC, this objective may include, but is not limited to, determine appropriate RBAC roles and commandlets, limit administration using existing role groups, configure a custom-scoped role group, evaluate differences between RBAC and Active Directory split permissions, and configure delegated setup. It's a lot to talk about, so let's get started. From a scenario perspective, we're going to be working with a company called Micromanagement Moguls. They love being able to assist companies in breaking up responsibilities. Their problem is that unlike earlier versions of Exchange that used ACLs or access control lists, role-based control, although easy on the surface through the GUI, can become a bit more complicated on the PowerShell level. Our goal is going to be to demonstrate how they can work with PowerShell to accomplish more detailed RBAC work. So let's start with a discussion of Role-Based Access Control 101. Prior to Role-Based Access Control, permission configuration was handled through ACLs, or Access Control Lists. And this was based off of various Active Directory objects. Every object that you wanted to delegate permissions had its own access control list, and each access control list was composed of multiple access control entries, or ACEs, and this defined what permissions each user or group had on that object. Now, to make this a little bit easier to manage through Exchange, Exchange had property sets, which was a group of attributes that were able to share a common access control entry. And that made it easier because then, instead of setting an access control entry on, let's say, 20 different attributes, those attributes could be added to a property set so that applying the access control entry to the property set would update the access control lists on each of the attributes. Alright, so that's the past. With Exchange 2013, things had to change, and this is really a different approach to solving the problem of granular access when it comes to being able to delegate to individuals just what you need. RBAC is actually, at the core, PowerShell commandlets and parameters. And you're going to see what this means. If you've worked with RBAC, which hopefully at this point you have, then you know that there are role groups, and maybe you've worked with those and worked with the basics, but really behind the scenes, behind those role groups and roles, are PowerShell commandlets and parameters. Now, rather than having administrators concerned with commandlets, those commandlets are grouped into roles which are organized into role groups. But the fact that PowerShell is really the underlying core to all of this, this really allows Exchange to do some powerful things, like presenting administrators only with the commandlets that they have permissions to run. So let's say an administrator doesn't have access to run the set-mailbox commandlet. Then that commandlet will not even be available to the administrator when the Exchange Management Shell is used. Not only will the commandlet not be found if the administrator tries to run it, but it won't even be part of tab completion in the Exchange Management Shell. So that's really neat that when you don't have the permission to use a PowerShell commandlet, it doesn't even come up in your list of commandlets when you hit the tab key. So what we mean by that is, let's say you're an administrator and you don't have the set-mailbox commandlet permissions assigned to you. When you open up the Exchange Management Shell, if you type set-m and hit the tab key, normally it would say mailbox. It would come up as part of the tab completion. But if you're not assigned that commandlet and you don't have permissions to use it, it won't even come up as part of the tab completion. So there's some real fun things like that when it comes to role-based access control. But let's get a little deeper on this in order to really understand how it works at its core. Alright, so we're still looking at the basics of RBAC. Let's talk about defined role groups. There are 12 different built-in admin role groups. And it's good to note that these role groups are also security groups in Active Directory. We're going to take a look at this in a moment. As far as roles, one or more roles are assigned to each role group. And roles have underlying commandlets and parameters, but the Exchange Admin Center doesn't show you too much. It really only shows you the roles. If you want to find out the commandlets and parameters to those roles, we're going to have to use PowerShell. And we'll do that in a little bit. But for now, let's just make sure we understand the Exchange Admin Center side to role-based access control. Assigning built-in role groups can all be done through the EAC. So let's jump over to our Exchange environment and see how this works as far as assigning these various role groups to individuals and seeing how then they have the ability to perform certain tasks. Alright, so here we are on our Windows Server 2012 CAS server, and we can see we have the Exchange Admin Center already up and running. We're under the Permissions feature in the Exchange Admin Center, and we're looking at admin roles. Now, here are the 12 built-in admin role groups. And as you click through each role group, it gives you a definition. We see the assigned roles for that role group, but we cannot see the underlying commandlets and parameters. But not to worry, we'll get to that in a moment. You can see here that this role group doesn't have any members. You can see the right scope. We haven't really talked about scopes much, but scopes really relate to the application of the role group itself and where it applies. Now, if we look through, we see delegated setup. We're going to talk about this at the end of the lesson, but here, members of this management role group have permissions to install and uninstall Exchange on provisioned servers. This role group shouldn't be deleted. And we see that the assigned roles view-only configuration. Discovery management. Members of this management role group can perform searches of mailboxes in the Exchange organization for data that meets specific criteria. You can see legal hold, mailbox search, and this is interesting because even the administrator has to be assigned into this role group in order to perform discovery management. You might say, but wait a minute, here we have organization management. This is really the top monster role group, and really you can do almost everything from organization management if you're assigned in here. Look at all the assigned roles, but you actually don't have the roles that relate to discovery. So the administrator is a member, but you don't have the legal hold and mailbox search as part of the organization management role group. So we see that discovery management's a good one. Help desk. Members of this management role group can view and manage the configuration for individual recipients and view recipients in Exchange organization. Hygiene management, and you can actually see by the assigned roles that they're really thinking of this in terms of ways to provide the lockdown of assignments based upon the individuals that you have in your organization and what you want to give them. Here we see public folder management. It's pretty intuitive there as far as what it's for and the number of roles that are assigned to it. Recipient management, so you can assign for persons to take care of recipients. That's their job. They don't have the ability to handle unified messaging, let's say, but they can take care of the recipient side. Records management, this revolves around things like audit logs, journaling, and so forth. Server management, which revolves around databases, database copies, connectors, things of that sort. You can see that this is an important role, and we'll talk about a little later on how if you have delegated setup, you may have the ability to install an Exchange server, but without server management, you won't have the ability to actually manage that Exchange server. We have UM management, and then view-only organization management. So I didn't read all of this to you because there's no point in doing that. Most likely you have a lab setup that you're working with, and you can go through and read these, but it's good to see that we have these built-in role groups that have roles that are assigned to them. Now let's just look at one, discovery management. We talked about this a moment ago. If we open this up, we can see again the description, we can see the right scope, that's the default, and we can adjust some of these things, but ultimately we see the roles that are assigned to it, and we can tweak this. We can add additional roles if we want to. And then we see the members. So if we click the plus sign for members, let's just choose two individuals, the administrator and Alan Wright. We'll add them in and say OK. Now Alan is not an administrator. Alan is just a user with a mailbox. And so now we're giving him the ability to perform discovery. How is that going to work for Alan? We know how it works for the administrator. The administrator is sitting here and says, okay, you know what? I'm going to go over to compliance management, and I'm going to be able to perform in-place e-discovery and hold. because I'm the administrator and I have that ability, and I have the ability to access the Exchange Admin Center, and we're good to go. Let's jump over to a Windows 8 system, and let's see what happens when Alan accesses the Exchange Admin Center. All right, we log in as Alan, and here we see that if Alan tries to access the Exchange Admin Center the exact same way that we would access the EAC as an administrator, Alan has to put in his username and password. And look at this. We see that the Exchange Admin Center actually adjusts to the permissions that Alan has. So he can see recipients, and in this case he has the ability to perform some basic viewing of recipients and so forth, and he has the ability to perform compliance management where he can perform in-place e-discovery and hold. But look at all the other tabs and how they're missing, and look at all the other features that are missing. So again, this is really what's cool about role-based access control and the way it's designed into Exchange, is that you have the ability to, let's say, provide other individuals within the organization, even users in this case, like Alan, the ability to perform certain tasks, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to do more than that. So that's the basics of role-based access control. That's the GUI side to it. Let's jump back over to our slides, and let's talk now about the Exchange Management Shell management of role-based access control. We'll find out what's inside of roles in terms of commandlets and parameters, and then after that we'll talk about how we can create our own roles and role groups if we'd like. Alright, so here you can see a listing of different commandlets that you'll be using with role-based access control. So you can see on the left all the different verbs that can be used with the component in the middle, and how in the end it creates these commandlets that we can use depending on what we're looking to accomplish. Now we're not going to use every single combination here in the lesson. We're going to use quite a number of them, however, in order for you to truly understand how role-based access control works by default and how you can actually tweak it so that you can create your own roles and your own role groups. Now, in addition to using the Exchange Management Shell, you might enjoy using other tools to work with RBC, like a tool called RBAC Manager, which is from Codeplex. This is a free tool that you can download from the Codeplex site. There's a link at the end of this lesson in the additional research where you can locate this tool. And personally, I've worked with it for several years. It's a great way to work with RBAC without having to go through the Exchange Management Shell. In addition, you can see quite a bit the way the various components work and the various parameters and so forth that are connected to them through ADSI Edit. That's another tool. That's for viewing the various commandlets and the permission settings for each of the roles that are currently in place, but it's not a tool for really managing and changing things. If we look at what's in a role, let's pick a built-in role group like Public Folder Management, which contains only two assigned roles, Mail-Enabled Public Folders and Public Folders. And what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to our server, and the first thing we're going to do is use the Exchange Management Shell to get the list of management role entries. So we're going to see the roles, and we'll see what entries go along with those roles in terms of commandlets. Now, if we want to see a list of parameters for a specific entry, then we would use the following commandlet. Again, we're using the get-management role entry. You can see that it's a little different in terms of how we structure this command. And then if we want to see which roles allow certain commandlets to run, we can again use the get-management role entry commandlet, and we can look to see which roles allow commandlets to run. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to our server, and we're going to use these commandlets to really peer inside the public folder management role in order to understand fully how this is all really built off of PowerShell commandlets and parameters. Alright, so we've been talking about the public folder management role group, which if we just jump back over to the EAC and we go back to permissions, here we have the public folder management role group, and we have two roles that are assigned to it. Now let's find out a little bit more about what makes up those roles in terms of role entries. So for starters, let's type get management role entry, and the role name in this case is public folders \**, and we're just going to pipe this out with the name. We hit enter. And here you can see that the public folders role is actually made up of these various commandlets that we see here. Get mailbox, get public folder database. We see the whole list of different commandlets that we can use if we have that role assigned to us, even if it's assigned to us through the role group. Being that we're part of that role group, we have that role assigned to us, and as a result, all of those commandlets are within our control. But that doesn't necessarily mean every single parameter for every single commandlet is within our control. And that's what's important to note, that just because you're given the ability to run a commandlet, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the parameters have been assigned to you. Now granted, many of the parameters are assigned to you perhaps, because obviously this is not meant to be overly defined down to the parameter level. But you can control this further if you'd like to by making customizations. To start with, however, let's actually get a list of parameters for a specific entry. So here, if we wanted to do something different and get the list of parameters, we could put this within parens. And if you're wondering why are we doing that, I don't really know, to be honest with you. The way that they developed PowerShell and how they worked some of these things out is really beyond my ability. But that's okay. I know how to follow the directions, and so that's all you really need to know is how to follow the directions. So in this case, we're going to type in the get-management role entry with public folders, and we're just choosing the get mailbox commandlet because it's part of the list that we saw, and we're asking for parameters. So we hit enter. And you can see these are the parameters that we can utilize with the get-mailbox commandlet when we're talking about the public folders role. So hopefully you're starting to see, oh, wait a minute, okay, so when we say PowerShell is really at the heart of RBAC, we really mean it, right down to the parameter level. Now, another thing you might do is you might want to see which roles allow certain commandlets to run. And so that was another one of the options we saw in the slide. In this case, we're going to use an asterisk, backslash, and we'll go with the new mailbox import request role. We hit enter. And so here you can see that specific commandlet is actually part of the mailbox import export role, and only that role. So if it was part of a variety of other roles, you would see that. In fact, here if we just jump back and do a very common one, you're going to see this is going to be in pretty much every role. Right, so there you go. So you can see how if you want to know which roles allow certain commandlets to run, you can use that command right there, the get-management role entry, and then put in the commandlet itself. This way, again, when you're trying to figure out what role you're going to base as the parent for your child roles that you might create, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, but it's good to know that you can actually find out what roles that currently exist allow certain commandlets to already run. Without getting too far ahead of ourselves, let's jump back over to the slides and let's talk a little bit about how you can actually adjust and configure these built-in roles and role groups, or more specifically, how you can create your own roles and role groups depending on the needs of the organization you're working with. All right, so now we understand that we have the various built-in roles, but what if we want to customize roles? Well, it's usually recommended that you first try to work with built-in role groups and roles. So even if a role group perhaps gives a little bit more permissions than what you're looking for, if that's okay in your environment, then use the built-in role group. However, if your hands are really tied in this respect and everything is really granular in your organization, so an individual should not have any more control than what has been assigned to them, well, then you're going to have to customize the various roles and role groups. To create a new custom management role, you need to start with an existing management role, which is the parent. And so the way this works is you have to decide what closely matches the role you're going to create for the individual or individuals, and then use that as your base moving forward. So let's say to create a new role based on the mailbox import export role, you would use the new dash management role. You'd give it a name, in this case mailbox import only. So let's say we want to create a new role that doesn't do import and export, just import. We would base that off of the parent mailbox import export. And then to view the newly created role, just to make sure that it's created and you can see it, you can view it with the same role entries as the parent because we haven't made any changes by using the get-management role entry and then putting in the name of this new role that we created, mailbox import only. However, now we want to make changes. So to remove the mailbox export request, we would use the get-management role entry. We would actually use the remove-management role entry to pull that from the list of parameters or entries for the mailbox import only customized role that we created. Alright, it's a lot when you're looking at it like this. Let's jump over to the Exchange server and let's take a look at how we would actually do this. Let's perform these exact steps. Alright, so to start with, we're going to create a new role based on the mailbox import export role. So we type in new management role and we have to provide a name. We're going to call it mailbox import only. And the parent role is mailbox import export. And we hit enter. And we can see that that role has now been created. And we can see the role type itself. Very good. Alright, so now just to confirm that that new role has the same role entries as its parent, if we type in get management role entry, and we put in the name of the role we just created with an asterisk at the end, \**, we're able to see the commandlets, the role, and then the parameters that go along with it. So we see it all in one shot there. That's great. But now as we look at this, we can see that there are export sides to this. Remove mailbox export request, new mailbox export request, suspend mailbox export request. So there are several mailbox export requests that we want to actually pull from the role itself, because this is mailbox import only. So how do we do that? Well, in this case, let's type get management role entry mailbox import only \** dash mailbox export request, and we're going to pipeline that out to remove management role entry, confirm false. We hit enter. Alright, and of course typically when it doesn't give us red error messages we assume that things are good. Let's just go back up though and let's take a look now at the role entries for the mailbox import only role that we created. Now you can see that all of the export side, the export requests, are removed from this role. So you can see how you can customize various roles. Now we have this new role, and we can add that role to existing role groups. We can create a new role group and add that role in. Or, as we'll talk about in a moment, we can assign this new mailbox import only role directly to administrators if we choose. So we have a lot of options. So here, if we go back to our Exchange Admin Center, and let's say we wanted to add that role into one of our other existing roles, let's say Discovery Management, we open this up, and here we can click Roles. Now we can see we now have the mailbox import only role that we can add there, and so we can add it right into the role group if we choose. Now we're not going to do that at this time, we have no real need to do that, but it's nice to know that you can take roles that we can create that are based off of parent roles, we can tweak those, and we can then assign them into role groups. But you know, there's another way we can assign roles that we've created to administrators. Let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk about the different methods of assigning these roles, whether it's through a role group or directly to administrators. You know, we talk about assigning roles to administrators typically through role groups. So you can use the Exchange Management Shell, the Exchange Admin Center, the RBAC Manager that we talked about, or you can add an account directly to a security group in Active Directory in order to assign permissions to administrators. Now, when you add an administrator's account to a management role group, the account gains every role that's specified on that role group. Logically, of course, we know that. Roles are added cumulatively. So if an administrator's account is a member of another role group, the account will retain those permissions in addition to the permissions assigned by the roles of the new role group. You'll note that unlike file permissions and things of that sort, there is no blocking of access. So we don't have the converse to this where we have most restrictive and least restrictive. It's not like file share permissions. It's all cumulative. But you don't have to assign a role to an administrator through a role group. Let's say you wanted to assign directly to an administrator a specific role. You can do that. You can use the new dash management role assignment, and here you can see we created this role, mailbox import only. Well, we can assign that role directly to our user Alan Wright without assigning Alan into a role group. Let's switch gears for a moment and let's talk about user roles. User roles are assigned to users using a role assignment policy. So that's a little different. Each mailbox can only have one role assignment policy attached to it. Management roles are tied to the role assignment policy with management role assignments. And Exchange creates a management role assignment object in Active Directory that will link that management role with the management role assignment policy. And you'll notice if you're browsing the management role assignment objects in Active Directory that among the assignments that link roles to role groups, you'll find assignments that link roles to assignment policies. And most of the roles that are assigned to users start with my. For example, my base options or my team mailboxes. In fact, the default roles that are assigned include my base options, my contact information, my voicemail, my text messaging, my distribution group membership, my marketplace apps, and my team mailboxes. And there are others. We'll take a look at this in a moment. But just so you understand these ones, these default ones, my base options, for example, this allows users to modify basic mailbox settings for their own mailbox. So that includes settings for managing their ActiveSync device, inbox rules, and so forth. My contact information gives users the ability to update their contact information in Active Directory. My voicemail allows users to change their voicemail settings, which includes the ability to do things like changing their PIN number. You can see how all of these are default roles. My text messaging allows users to manage their text messaging settings. My distribution group membership gives users the ability to change their own distribution group memberships. They can use this role to add or remove themselves from distribution groups if that's allowed on the distribution group itself. My marketplace apps, this allows users to manage their marketplace apps logically. And my team mailboxes allows users to create a site mailbox and connect it to SharePoint sites. Alright, let's jump back over to our server and let's take a look at some of the other roles that you can actually add to a role assignment policy for users. Alright, so we're back in the Exchange Admin Center under Permissions, and instead of looking at admin roles, we want to look at user roles. And you can see this default role assignment policy that exists. Again, you can create your own role assignment policies. You can only apply one policy to a mailbox at a time. So whatever you decide to do with that policy, you can actually utilize it directly with mailboxes. But in this case, we have the default, and if we open this up, we can see the default settings that we just talked about. My contact information, notice that my profile information, my distribution groups, these are not part of the default. Distribution group memberships is. My marketplace apps, my base options, but notice my retention policies and my custom apps, these can also be selected as part of the default role assignment policy, but by default they're not selected. And then even my diagnostics. This role enables end users to perform basic diagnostics on their mailbox, such as retrieving calendar diagnostic information. So you can see why, for the most part, from a default perspective, this might not be enabled for end users, but you have the ability to enable it if you'd like. So that's really the overall gist of the default role assignment policy and the basic policies that are included within it. As you can see here on the right, you're able to see which roles are included directly within that policy. Let's jump back over to our slides and let's switch gears a little bit and talk about split permissions and then delegated setup. Alright, switching gears just a little bit, let's talk about a split permissions model. Now you understand the way RBAC works at this point. The default permissions model is called shared permissions, where management of Exchange is not split, and you can use the Exchange tools to create security principles, like user objects in Active Directory. However, in larger organizations, there's a line between administrators that handle Exchange and those that handle Active Directory, and you can implement this using a split permissions model. Now, rather than have you figure out how to accomplish that, it's actually something that's presented to you when you perform an installation of Exchange. So you can see here, during the setup of your server, you're asked if you want to apply Active Directory split permissions to the Exchange organization. And it says there, the Active Directory split permission security model is typically used by large organizations that completely separate the responsibility for the management of Exchange and Active Directory among different groups of people. Applying this security model removes the ability for Exchange servers and administrators to create Active Directory objects such as users, groups, and contacts. The ability to manage non-Exchange attributes on those objects is also removed. And it makes it clear, it says you shouldn't apply this security model if the same person or group manages both Exchange and Active Directory. Now, just to make this something that's a little more tangible as far as an explanation, if you create a user in Exchange, you can also have it so that that user is now created back in Active Directory. Without that ability, you would have to make sure someone who handles Active Directory creates that user object, and then you can give them a mailbox, because that's your portion as the Exchange administrator. So splitting the permissions is something that is necessary at times. And rather than having to figure all of this out, you just click a checkbox and it splits those permissions for you. If you choose to enable Active Directory split permissions, you can only change back to shared permissions or RBAC split permissions by rerunning setup and disabling Active Directory split permissions. Alright, so now that you understand that, this is important whether you're in a production environment and you know that you need to do this for the organization you're working with, or as a consultant, you may see that this is something you need to do for certain organizations that you're working for. It's also good from a test prep perspective, because you never know when you're going to see a question that might test your knowledge of split permissions and what they're for. Now, we reviewed the various role groups that are built into Exchange, and there were 12 of them that we looked through. Delegated setup is an interesting one because it's a management role group that allows administrators to deploy Exchange 2013. However, even though you have this delegated setup management role group perhaps assigned to you, and just because you can deploy Exchange, that doesn't mean you can manage the server. That requires you to be part of the server management role group. So you can see how, again, the control is there, that you can assign someone the role group to deploy Exchange, but without the server management role group, they can't actually manage the server. Now, administrators who are members of the delegated setup role group, they can deploy servers running Exchange 2013, but those servers would have to be previously provisioned by a member of the organization management role group. So you provision a new server by using the setup/new provisioned server and then put in the server name. And so that would have to be somebody in the organization management role group that does that, puts in the name. It's not a big deal. It's just one extra step and one extra layer of control. And then those that are in the delegated setup management role group could go forward and perform the actual installation. One thing to note is that they will still need to be a local administrator on the server in order to install the prerequisites and the Exchange Server application itself. Alright, so going back to our scenario with micromanagement moguls, we've recommended, in their case, being that they're a small organization, that they use built-in role groups. But these folks are all about control to the parameter level, so they're going to be making new child roles and new role groups. That's their choice. We've given them the best recommendation for their environment. Now, the circumstances do not require split permissions model in their case, nor do they need to be concerned with delegated setup. And they appreciate that, and they will at least go along with that side of our recommendation. Some additional research that we recommend include RBAC Manager R2 for Exchange 2010, 2013, and Office 365, and you can see the link there from Codeplex. There's a good article on understanding split permissions, and that's from TechNet. And then, as far as books go, we're recommending the Mastering Exchange 2013 book. Just go to Amazon.com and do a search for Mastering Exchange 2013. Why this book? Well, it has about 1,000 pages of solid content, and I can vouch for that content, being that I'm the technical reviewer for the book. So we hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.